Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today to discuss Syria. You can hear me, right? Okay. My name is Kadir Ustun, and I work here at SETA DC as the research director. And we have received a lot of interest in this event, and I think the reasons are obvious to everyone. Challenges posed by the Syrian conflict are, enormous, I would say. In fact, they often look insurmountable. From the humanitarian crisis to the sectarian violence, from spillover effects to regional proxy wars, there's a lot to deal with and to discuss. We've organized this event on Syria partly to talk about these challenges, but also to draw attention to the regional aspects of the Syrian conflict. Is the current situation sustainable? Is there a political outcome that is achievable and sustainable? How is the region going to deal with instability over the next year or beyond and beyond? These are tough questions, and we may not or probably not find easy answers today in this discussion, but I'll pose them anyway to our panelists. And we have a very distinguished panel, and I would like to thank each one of them for being here, for participating. And I won't read their exhaustive bios in front of you. You can, but I'll say a couple sentences. Obviously, Ambassador Frederic is currently a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, and he was conferred the rank of ambassador and appointed by President Obama as special advisor for transition in Syria. And he has a distinguished career in diplomacy, as you all know. Aram Nerguizian, to my left, is a senior fellow with the Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. He focuses on strategic and military dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa. He has authored and co-authored books and reports on the Middle East and regional security issues that are extremely valuable and sometimes hard to read, honestly, but I go through them anyway. I think they're very important for all of us studying the Middle East. Erol Cebeci is our executive director here at SETA DC. Mr. Cebeci served as a member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, first as member and then as the chairman of the Turkish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He has a very distinguished career in politics, in Turkish politics. He's lived in this country for a long time as well, and he just got back from a long visit to Turkey. I think he has many observations to share with us today. So I'll turn to Mr. Cebeci as the first speaker, and then we'll go to Ambassador Hoff, and then we'll turn to Aram. Thank you for being here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Kadir Bey, and thank you very much for coming in. Have a good afternoon. From the very beginning, the nightmare scenario for Turkey was a prolonged sectarian civil war in Syria. And there is every indication that this is the case, and Syria's neighbors will be affected by the huge spillover effects. This has been already happening in the last 2.5 years, not only in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. You can see the effects of the Syrian civil war. The longer the conflict goes on, the worse for Turkey, especially, and its interests and vision of the region, and peace and stability for the people of the countries in the region. Syria has both soft and hard security problems and threats for Turkey. And it seems that the current situation in Syria will only get worse for the foreseeable future, and the lack of consensus among the lack of consensus and inaction among the international community over the past 2.5 years have prevented any meaningful, decisive action. I just came back from Turkey the day before yesterday, and I spent almost 2.5 weeks. And I was not in the border region, but I have talked to people who came to Turkey from Syria, and I have talked to some people who are in both political and the political opposition in Syria. And I have not seen one single person who is more hopeful at this point than they were 6 months or a year ago. And now I would like to give you a general overview of the situation from a Turkey perspective and make comments on a few issues. Now, when you talk to Turkish authorities, the policymakers, and when you listen to them, that you can conclude easily that Turkey has worked to help to reach an international agreement on the fate of Syria, but this was not being possible. Turkey at some point has really pushed for measures that could help bring an end to the fighting, with such measures such as a no-fly zone or a security zone, but as you all know that the Russian and Chinese opposition to this in the UN Security Council has made all of those attempts futile. The use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime at some point, and this has been used more than once, that was considered as a red line by the US government and most of the European governments. Actually did not change the equation or anything on the ground other than making it worse for military. After the August 21st use of chemical weapons, which was the most extensive use and most heavy use of the weapons, United States' initial decision to strike and punish the Syrian regime for crossing a red line has created somewhat a hope that this might be a turning point, but we all know how that ended and how that turned into a chemical weapons deal. And that chemical weapons deal, the problem with that, as the most of the Turkish policymakers see it, that it allows the international community to somehow think that they are addressing the Syrian problem. So the Syrian crisis becomes an entirely a chemical weapon problem. This crisis is much larger than the kinds of weapons that the regime uses. Without a serious international commitment to the resolution of the crisis, the conflict will continue and affect all of Syria's neighbors, regardless of what happens in the chemical weapons deal. Now, Turkey has welcomed the deal, and that Turkey has seen it as a step in the right direction, but the deal does not include measures to hold the Assad regime accountable in case of a failure of a full elimination of the chemical weapons. The regime already is showing signs that it is unwilling to complete the dispose of the chemical weapons production capabilities. Assad has played its smart so far by cooperating with the chemical weapons elimination process, but it will be a long road before we can verify that the regime has cooperated fully. In the meantime, this deal rendered the regime is indispensable both politically and diplomatically, because the regime's cooperation is needed for the chemical weapons deal to succeed. The hope is that this might lead to a political process whereby the opposition and the regime can reach an agreement of a transitional government. This hope in the region is really non-existent. And the regime also feels emboldened because of the advances that the regime has made militarily in and around Aleppo and Damascus. And if the international community does not insist on a transitional government, it will be very difficult to reach a viable deal, since the regime will likely insist that Assad continue to rule as a president. So this brings me to Geneva 2, and we all heard on Monday the opposition has decided to attend the Geneva 2 conference without requiring their earlier condition that Assad play no role in a future transitional government. But instead it now requires something different, a full access for delivery of humanitarian aid and the release of political prisoners, neither of which can be guaranteed by anybody. And again, in the region, when you talk to people, especially the humanitarian access, everybody believes that this is used by the Assad regime as a military tool, as a punishing tool, so that the Assad regime will never be giving that one up. The opposition in this process, when they were pressured by the Western countries, including Turkey and the United States, the opposition has had to choose between talking with the regime and facing a lot of criticism that it is increasingly irrelevant if they don't talk to the regime. But they accepted to go to Geneva under the international pressure, and they know that this will not help them in the future negotiations because they want to be negotiating from a strong point. Chances of success at Geneva 2, which is not even scheduled yet, continue to be slim in the eye of almost everybody in the opposition. But for most of the observers and most of the people, the analysts you talk in Turkey, that it is better to have a political track open and working than the current state. Now, two more issues that I would like to cover before I end. That is, one is support for the armed opposition groups. This has been discussed and talked between the outside countries. And there have been much talk about supporting the moderate groups against the regime. But the international community has failed clearly to come up with a common strategy to fund, support, and arm the Free Syrian Army so far, in a way that could seriously destabilize the regime. There are many legitimate worries about providing weapons to the opposition, but when this was not done under a coherent international supervision with an agreed-upon framework, it was left to the various mechanisms and countries and outside powers to support different opposition groups. This has led to basically the fracturing of the opposition as well as empowering of the Al-Qaeda-linked groups and extremists. There has been a case also made that giving arms to the opposition can make the situation worse. But the reality is that when there is no serious effort and clear strategy to supply the moderate opposition with funding and arms, the opposition is unable to emerge as the single front against the regime. This is where Al-Qaeda linked groups becomes really relevant. Turkey has faced certain criticism that it was turning a blind eye to weapons flowing to the extremist groups. But the problem is what I just said earlier, that it is extremely difficult to know exactly, and this is what you get when you talk most of the Turkish policymakers, that it is extremely difficult to know exactly which government is providing what kind of resources to which groups. But some of these resources and funds and weapons that end up at Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. Turkey has a clear policy to support the opposition, and there have been reports about arms being smuggled into Syria throughout the Turkish territory. But Turkey is not in the business of supplying Al-Qaeda-linked groups because this will be going against their stated objective and their main purpose of supporting a unified Syrian opposition. And On this issue, I can elaborate on the PYD, the Patriotic Union of Kurdish, who has in the northeast of the Syria has some claims, and also the certain countries, including the Assad government, has a lot of hand on the certain claims that how Turkey is supporting and turning a blind eye to weapons passage. Refugees now, there is more than 600,000 refugees, the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and only 1/3 of them lives in camps and the container houses. The rest, the 2/3 are within the regular population. And this is compared to other countries in the region, Turkey has taken care of this problem relatively better and having a long-term plan for this one and preparing for the longer haul for the refugees. And there are tension over refugees of in Turkey, and this is also, there were some incidents in the past. And in the region, there are certain outreach, so to speak, or certain nuances in the policy changes. And for the keen observers, this is something that they can realize that Turkey and Iraq had really difficult relations in the last year and a half. And Turkey and Iraq, mutually, they are trying to restore the relationships back into the earlier status. And it is expected by the end of December or early January that the Iraqi Prime Minister to visit Turkey. And this is something that both countries are investing and putting political capital. And this has a couple of areas that this might be helpful, and I will tie them up. And also, we believe, or I believe, that the Syrian conflict can benefit from a possible deal, however weak is the success of that deal is between Iran and P5+1. And Iran is the main backer of the Assad regime, and it is clear that a political solution to the Syrian conflict will have to be endorsed by Iran, if not made with Iran. If there is a nuclear deal, Iran might be more comfortable talking to the international community about Syria. Now, obviously, Turkey attempts at engaging the Baghdad government and also Iran may help with easing the situation in Syria. Iran has the power to spoil a political deal, and engagement with Iran is crucial for influencing Assad's regime behavior. Now, the last issue that I would like to address is the increased sectarian undertones of in the region. Now, it is very clear to everybody that since 2003, the Iraqi invasion, the sectarian fault lines in the region are at move. So the Syrian conflict has really affected the entire region and brought both Iran and Saudi Arabia into competition for their regional influence. And this is something that we have known earlier. This is not something new, but they have a new playground, so to speak. When these powers use the Syrian conflict for the regional aims, it is no longer about ending the conflict and the political stability in Syria, but it is the competition between the two extremes in the sectarian struggle. This will not go away instantly, but somehow the international community have to find a way to make the Syrian conflict about Syria, not the regional powers' area of influence. Now, critics in this issue have presented Turkey is falling into a Sunni camp in this environment. Now, for those of you who have studied or understood the Turks as a society, the sectarian feelings probably up until like 2-3 years ago were the least among all the Muslim populated nations in the world in Turkey. Even though it had an indigenous Alawite population. This is still, Turkey was still, if you can measure these feelings of Shia-Sunni divisions, probably Turkey would be faring up at the least caring of these differences. And nobody can deny that what has happened in Syria has really moved certain things in Syria. But still, putting the Turkey to the Sunni camp automatically does not match with the reality. And if you look at the efforts of the Turkish government and the foreign minister, what he does when he goes to visit other countries. He was in Iraq the day before yesterday, and he spent probably more time with the Shia leaders of Sistani and Beni Sadr and in Karbala and Najaf than he spent in Burke. So it is easier to put that into the map as the Turkey falls on the Sunni camp and is somehow in a race with Saudi Arabia, but this falls far short of the reality and the Turkish ambitions and vision for the region, because what I have known and what they repeat over and over, that cannot produce anything healthy for any country or any people in the region. Let me stop over here, and I would be very happy to answer any questions if they come up later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Haq.
Thank you, Kadir Bey, and good afternoon to one and all. I think what I will try to do, what I might most usefully do this afternoon, very briefly at that, is try to explain as best I can what the policy of the Obama administration is at this point in response to these incredible challenges that Erol mentioned. Kadir mentioned at the outset that Syria is a problem for which there are no easy answers. I'd really like to endorse that. This really is a problem from hell in the classic sense. Now I worked on this problem during the opening phases. I left the Syria business in the Department of State in September 2012, and since November I've been at the Atlantic Council in the Hariri Center writing and speaking about Syria, a subject that's been close to my heart, frankly, since I was a 16-year-old American Field Service exchange student in Damascus. What I see happening to this country is beyond heartbreaking, and my own Syrian host family has been caught up in these events. I try as best I can to stay in touch with them, but I do want you to have the sense that I really do care about this, and as I try to explain administration policy, I'll try to avoid editorializing, but I'll tell you up front, just in terms of truth in advertising, what I find difficult when I try to analyze all of this. I think I understand what the administration's objective is. What I have some difficulty understanding, despite trying to keep up contacts with folks inside the administration, is the strategy being pursued in order to try to achieve that objective. Now, Erol mentioned at the outset, that the beginning of this latest phase in strategic evolution occurred on August the 21st, when we had this unspeakable chemical atrocity take place in the suburbs of Damascus. And Erol mentioned that there may be a tendency on the part of the Obama administration at the end of the day to try to define Syria as an arms control problem Because if Syria is defined as an arms control problem, then there is a pretty good chemical weapons framework agreement out there that's been endorsed by the UN Security Council. And by all accounts, to date, this thing is being implemented pretty faithfully. But I think in fairness, the administration, starting with the president, does understand that the chemical weapons aspect of this problem is simply the tip of an almost bottomless iceberg that represents the essence of the problem in Syria. And if you look at what's happening on the ground, it is truly amazing. And in my view, it's almost the sum total of a whole lot of unintended consequences that have come to the fore over the past 30 months. It was never, I can assure you, the objective of President Barack Obama that a series of Al-Qaeda affiliates and like-minded jihadist organizations should establish themselves in the eastern part of Syria, in essence, trying to recreate the freedom of action that Al-Qaeda once enjoyed in Afghanistan. This is not the intention of the President of the United States, but this is what's occurring. What we're seeing in Syria right now is a sort of informal, de facto partition of the country working out. And I don't mean in a legal sense. I don't mean that boundaries are about to change anytime soon, but just as a practical matter, you see the Assad regime consolidating itself basically in the western part of the country, alongside the Golan Heights, alongside Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, and with frontage on the Mediterranean Sea. You see to the east, Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations and other extremists establishing themselves, groups that seem to be, frankly, more interested in establishing various forms of pseudo-Islamic governance in the areas that regrettably fall under their jurisdiction. Plus, and Erol alluded to this, you've got some Kurdish activity, which is rather complex, seems to be driven by the Syrian PKK affiliate, the PYD, perhaps aimed at linking together various Kurdish areas and perhaps even sealing the Turkish border. But in essence, what you have is the country being divided between a long-time state sponsor of terror and terror itself. This is the mother of all unintended consequences. And I'd ask you to consider this very carefully, because usually when we talk about unintended consequences in this country in the context of Syria, we're dealing with hypotheticals. You know, what if the United States had actually, in late August, neutralized the regime, artillery, aircraft, rockets, and missiles that were terrorizing Syrian populations and continue to do so on a daily basis? What would have been the unintended consequences? I mean, we can remember all those debates, right? Because, our representatives in Congress were kicking all this around. My point is a very simple one. It's okay to talk about hypotheticals, but let's not forget what's staring us right in the face in Syria. A geopolitical catastrophe of the first order. For 23 million Syrians, for their immediate neighbors, and indeed for Europe, ultimately, and for the world. Now, what is the administration trying to do about this? As I said, I think the objective is pretty clear. And Erol was speaking. I tried to write it down as completely as I could. The objective would be a complete, negotiated transition of political power from the Assad regime to a transitional governing body, exercising full executive power, one created at a Geneva conference on the basis of mutual consent. And the terms mutual consent and full executive power, in the view of the administration, add up to a situation that all but guarantees no role for the Assad regime in the future governance of Syria. This is the objective. Get to a Geneva II conference and implement a formula that was contained in the Geneva I conference in June 2012, the so-called final communique of the Action Group on Syria. And I should say, just on a personal note, I was at Geneva as a U.S. government negotiator. I think I'm probably more responsible than anybody else for the mutual consent clause that is in that agreement. So I am neither an enemy nor a skeptic when it comes to Geneva. But when we move from the objective to the strategy being used to achieve that objective, then there are some problems. And I'll tell you what I think the most fundamental problem is. The administration is trying to pull off a diplomatic tour de force that would be, maybe somebody up here can come up with an example to contradict me, but I think it's probably unprecedented in all of human history. We can read in the newspapers on a daily basis the Assad regime on the ground inside Syria with tremendous ongoing support from Russia and Iran, scoring one tactical victory after another. Okay? Whether it's in the Damascus suburbs or Aleppo or elsewhere. Every day in the newspapers, we're seeing the regime making advances on the ground. What is it, then, that is supposed to oblige a regime that thinks it's winning and has some objective evidence to the effect that it is indeed winning? What is it that is supposed to oblige that regime to come to Geneva and execute a formula that will inevitably produce its political demise? Okay? And here's where the question mark exists in my mind. There seems to be some reliance on the part of the administration on Russia being the critical variable here that would pull off a diplomatic result that otherwise probably shouldn't happen. I mean, generally speaking, there's a relationship, right, between political results on the ground and, military results on the ground and political consequences flowing from it. So there seems to be some reliance here on Russia. What is observable so far, from my point of view, is that there may be times when Moscow and the Assad regime are not on the same page tactically. Okay? There was a recent meeting in Geneva between Ambassador Robert Ford and a Syrian Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Kadir Jamil. Okay? Mr. Jamil flew into Geneva from Moscow. He is a person who's been very close to the Russians. He had a meeting with Mr. Ford. He was subsequently and immediately fired by the regime in Damascus for doing an unauthorized meeting. Now, like many people, my initial impression was, yeah, the regime is firing him to increase his credentials, because what Mr. Jamil was proposing to Ambassador Ford was that he should be part of the opposition delegation at Geneva, a rather incredible proposition. But I'm reliably told that in fact the regime was quite angry about Jamil taking this meeting, and that his firing was genuine. Okay, so Russia, the regime, maybe not always on the same page tactically. What I have been unable to find, quite frankly, is any evidence that they are not on the same page strategically. Okay? The chemical weapons agreement was designed, at least in part, to make sure that the Assad regime would not be targeted by U.S. military strikes. Russian resupply to the regime with conventional weaponry has increased since the chemical weapons agreement. So it seems to be arguable that Russia's objective here is to facilitate the survival of Mr. Assad in some form in Syria. And if that is the case, that really puts a question mark on U.S. strategy here. I'm willing to assume that Secretary Kerry and others believe that there is some possibility of Russia playing a good role here. But there is also a question of just how much leverage Russia would have if the message to Assad is it's really time to go. And I question, I've had Russians tell me that they question how much real influence they have there. Finally, I think it is very questionable whether or not a Geneva conference is going to take place. The opposition, the Syrian National Coalition, has indicated its readiness to go to Geneva, but has also listed some conditions which very cleverly and, in my opinion, very wisely were drawn from a communique, for the most part, issued on October 22nd by the so-called London 11, led by the United States. The most important of these conditions, and I think the most important thing for American diplomacy to focus on right now, whether or not Geneva takes place, is the humanitarian situation in Syria. Russia may not be able to compel Bashar al-Assad to leave power, but surely Russia, and for that matter, Iran, must have some leverage when it comes to trying to convince this miserable regime to release prisoners and to stop the bombardments of residential populated areas. So I would predict that in the run-up to Geneva, this is probably going to be where American policy really places its emphasis in a practical manner.
Thank you very much, Aram.
Well, of course, is mic on. Well, my thanks to Erol Bey and Fred for their presentations. And Kadir is right that our 300-page reports are difficult to read through. I'll try not to emulate one of those by giving you a few points on regional dynamics and how all of this is playing out, impacting a Levant that is likely to be unstable and difficult to manage for at least a decade. But before I do so, I think both the previous talking points alluded to an uncertain military balance in Syria that deserves a little bit of attention. In terms of the opposition dynamics now at the end of 2013, yes, you have seen an ability to maintain some of the ground gained in places like the north, certainly in and around Idlib, and also Aleppo, although that remains to be seen for the long term in terms of a stable opposition structure. There are lessons learned that matter. You do have now a shift in the insurgency over the last year that has returned to the fundamentals of attrition warfare in a bid to erode morale within the Assad regime and the military. Things like killing individual soldiers, sniping high-value targets, and sapping general morale. You do have all the tensions that come with the preeminence of jihadi and Islamist militant factions playing a larger role in the armed uprising. You have all of the contradictions of having the Nusra Front, ISIS or ISIL, whichever you call it, and the rest of the armed opposition essentially in a multi-vector pattern that is the equivalent of a war within a war. You have had no real inroads that matter strategically or in terms of even limited tactical gains in Latakia. And you've seen, as Fred alluded, meaningful reversals that are really problematic in places like Damascus, certainly along the border with Lebanon and the Bekaa, and also eventually further south with the border with Jordan. You've had the reversals in Qusair, you've had difficulties in places like Hama, and all of this is also complicated by all the divisions within even the moderate elements of the armed opposition, all of the pressures of poor command and control, and the West's growing and continued alienation when it comes to dynamics of support for militant and jihadi factions. The Assad regime, meanwhile, has shifted its tactics too. A failed counterinsurgency strategy that was national in scope has now shifted over the course of 2013 to a civil war pattern that is far more stable, has far more conservative estimates in terms of what the effort is geographically more tied into centers of power that matter, and in many ways is a reflection of choices by Assad and by the regime not to emulate the trajectory of other minority groups that have fought unsuccessfully in civil wars where you have this sort of imbalance. The best example that I can think of would be the level of disunity and fragmentation that you saw within the Lebanese Maronite community in the initial stages of the Lebanese civil war, a pattern that has thus far at least been avoided by the Alawites, by the regime and its allies. Defections have slowed down to a trickle. You've had no real dynamics in terms of shifts and movement away from the Assad forces, in part because you already have seen a significant shift, and there is no clear indicator that any of those who have left the regime structure can see a stable end state in terms of the opposition that has a meaningful command and control structure for the military, let alone a political process that ensures their inclusion and the avoidance of some kind of Iraq-style de-Baathification. And 3 years of violence and bloodshed have ensured that a 60 to 80,000 strong core within the Assad forces ironically are more dangerous, more lethal, and more motivated, despite the effects of attrition and the loss of a meaningful NCO corps, of a standing, bloated Syrian armed forces in 2011, which was the byproduct of 30 years of political and military mismanagement and largesse. The gains along the south-north axis are real. They're real in Homs. They could be much more significant in Aleppo, and it remains to be seen what will happen next in terms of regime and Hezbollah operations in and around Al-Qalamun. However, the regime, again, by virtue of the dynamics in the country, cannot reverse or take back the country. You do have real force fatigue, and this is evident in the role that Hezbollah junior veterans, young 30-year-olds, are increasingly playing as a stopgap for the Syrian military's NCO corps. Without their presence, you have real shifts in terms of morale in urban warfighting scenarios. And while you do have consolidation of a quote-unquote Western Syria, not unlike the way Fred described it, you still have real questions about how any of this will stabilize. You have numbers on both sides that anecdotally, while somewhat difficult to measure, and the modern equivalent of a non-metric. You have to remember this is a dynamic civil war where any semblance of a reliable estimate is at best that, an exercise. You do have, for now, in 2013, some kind of a balance pitting opposition forces, which include the jihadists, some of the less but still hardline elements, Brotherhood affiliates, and those tied to the SMC on the one hand, and the structures that are tied or aligned with the regime on the other. Structures like what remains of the 4th Armored and the Republican Guard, the new National Defense Force, which plays a critical rear guard role and mans checkpoints. And we can't forget the role of Hezbollah elite fighters, young veterans who joined in maybe a year and a half ago who have now become seasoned combatants, and of course, Iraqi Shiite fighters as well. 2 years and a half of some aid, but no meaningful shift in terms of military aid directly to some of these factions from the West, have not reversed the reality that you have World War I era command and control and communications. It also does not reverse the fact that Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and their allies are the byproduct of a much longer trajectory with lead time in terms of systems, and that too is very difficult to reverse in ways that have strategic impact. You also have a pattern that has not changed since the beginning of the conflict, which is that you still have an inability by the armed opposition to conduct true mass infantry offensives against armed garrisons that in some cases even have limited garrison manpower. However, the regime also has some real problems that it cannot contend with. It really cannot find the base to stop the effects of manpower loss and the reality that the majority of Syria is Sunni. There's also an inability to conduct the kinds of high-intensity combined armed and infantry assaults that would be necessary to take back areas that are under opposition control. You also have real implications for things like the Israeli-Hezbollah strategic pattern in the region. Hezbollah is involved in a conflict in Syria that it views as a necessary war of choice, essentially fighting Sunnis in Syria today in order to avoid what it thinks is a battle with Sunnis in Lebanon tomorrow. Whether that is misguided or not is frankly irrelevant. It is something that is viewed as a almost axiomatic point, not among only those that are aligned with Hezbollah, but broadly Shiites who maybe a year ago would have said that they were not necessarily ideologically in sync with the organization. You have some concerns that have been addressed in terms of Israel's security posture, things like the threat from chemical weapons, but you still have real threats from surface-to-air missiles and their proliferation, as well as things like ship-to-ship and anti-tank capability, to say nothing of the proliferation of Islamist militants. The new rules on the Golan and in Syria, in terms of Israeli-Hezbollah competition, are directly tied to the erosion of the Assad regime and the emergence of the armed opposition. You no longer have long-term planning in Israel for a reserve armored corps. You have more flexibility in how resources are used, and you have more flexibility in terms of targeting Hezbollah directly in Syria, as opposed to opening up possible arenas of competition in Lebanon. That is not to say that there is no major risk of another Israeli-Hezbollah conflict on the sidelines of an already complicated Syrian civil war. What it does mean is that both sides have found ways to try and deal with the Syria conflict, have found new ways in terms of checking each other, especially so far as the Israelis are concerned, but that the risks of miscommunication and overestimates are real. Now, in terms of the regional countries, and what all of this and everything that Erol and Frederic discussed has done, let's go through them one by one in short order. Lebanon is a country now where 1 in 3 is Syrian, or a Syrian refugee, to say nothing of the population of labor migrants. You have real and tangible decline in stability and security in the north, in the Bekaa. You have a crisis of political leadership, the absence of legitimate executive authority, a parliament whose legitimacy is in question, and all of the questions tied to a security environment that is deeply suspect. Dynamics are so challenging in Syria that they have triggered a pattern now that frankly has not been seen since Lebanon became a modern independent state. The effort within the Lebanese military to gain political traction and support for a 5-year capabilities development plan, and the fact that the Lebanese government, interim though it might be, has actually funded the first fiscal year, is unprecedented and frankly has gone largely unignored. It does emphasize just how real the pressures are. Jordan has to deal with many of the same pressures and all of the patterns that come with having a massive refugee population. And all of this with a backdrop of economic instability, pressures on job creation, income and service delivery. It's also a country where the dangers of Saudi strategic competition with Iran in Syria are most tangibly felt in the short term, especially if Jordan does become over time a launch pad for at least some aspect of Saudi efforts to arm, train, and equip fighters that are opposed to Assad. Iraq is also increasingly dealing with the real patterns of Sunni-Shiite competition that Erol described, and that while many countries have tried to avoid, they really cannot avoid what is essentially a battle within Islam. You also have all of the risks of blowback and further instability that come with the Iraqi Shiites engaging in the 21st century's most meaningful proxy war in the Middle East. For Turkey, I won't go over it in detail, but to echo some of the points, we've seen a Turkey that's gone from an effort to create zero problems on every border to problems on every border that matter. There are ways to reverse this, and there are ways to show strategic patience and pragmatism, and there does seem to be some shift in that direction. The risks in Syria are defined more and more, especially as we shift attention towards discussion of P5+1 talks with Iran, to the reality that Saudi-Iranian zero-sum competition will outlive and outlast any initial, even partial deal with Iran. The issues there are too deep, the outcomes are too critical, and both countries look at Syria as an arena where they must secure a meaningful and tangible win. I also agree wholeheartedly with Fred that the most tangible issue now, especially for countries with the resources, or at least the ability to conduct resourcing, is a massive refugee flow to fragile states in the region and countries that frankly have had a difficult time managing existing refugee populations. As of October, and this number has certainly moved upwards, you're talking about somewhere to the effect of 2.2 or 2.3 million Syrians outside of Syria, in countries that have none of the infrastructure and resourcing to deal with the effects. UNHCR has been allocated a figure that puts it just shy of 70% of its required threshold for 2013, and 2014 is likely to be an even more challenging year in terms of resourcing, especially in an environment where much of the funding from the Gulf does not go necessarily through the conventional UN structures. So with all of this, how do we size up the quest for regional and international responses to Syria? We are still going to see over the next year, if not longer, a pattern of failed accommodation, shifting strategic competition, and the quest for, and I agree here that the U.S. is chief among the states seeking this, some form of acceptable end state that guarantees regional stability, or at least puts the region on a path to stability. CW demobilization has shifted the pace and has created some real risks that were described. False flagging, shifting some of the attention, buying time. But it also presents opportunities that are difficult to ignore, and also in some cases could be precedent setting. The U.S. is slowly coming to terms with a key pattern, that it cannot win popularity contests in the Middle East or the Levant more narrowly, and that it must focus on pragmatic policies tied to stability and not the preferred ideological end state that exists in theoretical modeling and not in real-world geopolitics. Focusing on one set of talks, such as Geneva II, ignores the fact that any other cycle of sectarian violence and civil war rarely ends with the first or the second effort at a negotiated outcome. You will have multiple attempts There is a need for long-term optimism and not banking on one set of talks. There's also a need, and there is certainly some shift to this, in accepting the primacy of external forces in determining at least some aspects of the internal balance. More than at any time, local forces fighting either side of this are captive audiences when it comes to aid, when it comes to ideology, and when it comes to realignments. And in many ways, though this is certainly not certain, shifts at the regional, international level will have an impact at the local, even if local forces do not accept, do not want to accommodate, or try to rebel. The best example of this is, again, another country that has seen proxy warfighting and balance of power politics, namely Lebanon. You had an end to a civil war that nobody wanted and that everybody had to accept. Right now you have, as Fred describes, a divided Syria. It's slowly shifting to a place where kinetic military operations will always be there, but are far less mobile, and you will have a somewhat flexible dividing line between regime control and the lack of regime control. Whatever happens in this, whether it's in this year, next year, even if you have a meaningful set of agreements before this year is out, all of the pressures we just all described across these three presentations highlight a Levant that will be at war with itself over demographics, economics, job creation, and the search for stability and security for at least a decade, if not longer. And with that, I'll stop and we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you very much. I'll simply turn over to the audience before pausing any questions so we have more time for questions. Please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, be brief, and ask a question. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Mohammed Ghanem, Director of Government Relations for the Syrian American Council. A couple of questions, one for Erol and one for Fred. My first question is more about Turkish domestic politics than it is about Syria. 2 days ago, the KNC, the Kurdish National Council, were a large umbrella group for a lot of Syrian Kurdish parties, was formally integrated into the official opposition. They got 11 seats. Yesterday, the PYD, the Syrian version of the PKK, announced secession, plans for secession for a semi-autonomous region, and they said that those plans will be implemented within 6 months. How would that complicate the peace efforts at home in Turkey in terms of the talks with Öcalan? And then question for Fred. You said you don't think the administration wanted to, although this is what is staring us in the face in Syria right now in terms of unintended consequences, you don't think the administration necessarily wanted that. What do you think about what Dennis McDonough reportedly said about bleeding Iran and Hezbollah thing, running them thin and bleeding them thin? And how would the United States deal with Assad running for re-election next year, if that happens?
Thank you. Mr. Cebeci.
The peace efforts at home with PKK, definitely, whatever PYD says in terms of their independence or their decision-making being separate from the PKK, I think it is no secret to everybody who studies and understands the topic that there is a very strong link. And Turkey has been very open and very straightforward in their direct talks to PYD leadership and through the intermediaries, that whatever PYD is doing in the last few days is not an acceptable thing for Turkey, and it will not recognize what you can call that creating a de facto situation. And Turkey has encouraged PYD all along to have a clear side in terms of the struggle against the Assad government and the regime. So I think the PYD's decision was to, it was an opportunity for them to use the Syrian National Coalition announcement of the joining the Geneva II. And I believe the relationship between Turkey and the northern Iraqi, the leadership Barzani, on this issue will eventually put some pressures on the PYD's decision to implement whatever they announced. And I think the solution process, what is called in Turkey with the Kurdish problem, is bigger than what PYD can influence alone. And I don't think the PKK leadership will allow PYD to derail the process. So the process is bigger, and these are conjectural and temporary. And I think, again, I'm guessing that the PYD will switch positions or will not implement or will not find the environment to implement the decision that they have taken.
If I understood the first question addressed to me correctly, I think it has to do with published reports that have appeared to the effect that White House Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough suggested that what's happening in Syria really isn't so bad because you got the equivalent of Iran and Hezbollah fighting it out endlessly in a sort of Vietnam type struggle. First of all, I know Dennis McDonough, and he's an extraordinarily talented and ethical individual. I kind of doubt that he said anything that blunt. That said, we all occasionally articulate things that on reflection we may wish we had never said, and this sort of a sentiment may just sort of reflect, if anybody said it, a reflexive reaction to criticism of administration inaction. People could say, well, if you look at the situation, it's really not too bad. There are a couple of bad guys slugging it out, killing one another. What could be wrong with that? I kind of doubt that Dennis said anything that direct. I think what I can say for sure, occasionally I criticize administration policy. It's always the policy of the Atlantic Council that when you do that, you try to offer concrete suggestions which way the policy should go. I think I can say that this does not represent U.S. policy. If it did, it would represent a real moral deficit. Because if what you're talking about is subjecting 20 plus million Syrians to, as Aram mentioned, possibly 10 years or more of this, just so that Iranians and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda people can leave. You've got a situation where this country is going to continue to hemorrhage major parts of the population into surrounding countries, including allies and friends of the United States. So as a practical matter, even if someone in the administration imagined that this would be a good approach, I don't think it would get to first base. I don't think the president would approve it or anything. On the Assad re-election, my suspicion is if an election occurs in Syria in May or June of next year, it would occur in areas controlled by the regime, and I would go out on a limb and predict that Bashar al-Assad will win that election. He may win it. He may indeed win it convincingly. I think it will be regarded by the United States and most countries in the world quite properly as a non-event.
Thank you. We'll take several questions. One over there. So, one back there and one here, please.
Thank you, Abbas Kadem with the Embassy of the Republic of Iraq. I would like to start from the end of the last presentation. Aram mentioned that the economic issue, which is sometimes left out because most of the debate talks about the political conflict and how it is resolved. Now, international organizations estimate that if the Syrian economy would recover at 5% annually right now, it would take Syria 30 years, that is, makes you more optimist than the international organizations, to recover to pre-conflict levels. Now, bearing in mind that pre-conflict levels were not impressive in Syria, and also that post-conflict reconstruction sometimes is not just a post-conflict issue, but also a conflict resolution issue. Who is going to pick the bill, and what will that leave for the Syrian regime right now, or whoever is to follow him, to govern Syria and create a stable or maintain a stable regime? And should the post-conflict reconstruction be on the table in Geneva? Thank you.
Thank you. Right there, right there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Never. I blog as I'm a political economy blogger. It's kind of policy. My question actually goes
Could
to...
you speak a little louder?
My question is to Ambassador Hall. Earlier you had mentioned that Moscow and Damascus aren't always on the same page tactically. So I was just wondering if you'd be able to kind of glean into the future at Geneva too, if there are any tactical missteps that Moscow and Damascus might not agree on that may actually help move the negotiation process forward, similar to the CW kind of, it sidestepped the actual issue, but it made a bit of progress in one respect.
Mark and Torben here.
For anyone on the panel, my normal question is, it seemed in the run-up to the McDonough walk in the garden with the president that the military in the United States showed no appetite whatsoever for any kind of intervention in Syria, described to me by a JCS officer as a kind of filibuster of American policy. And in fact, General Dempsey, during testimony on the Syria question, said he did not know what the American goal was in Syria. Given this foot dragging, once you take force off the table, there's no incentive for Syria to come to a negotiated agreement. So absent that, is there any other leverage that can be used by the United States, given that the U.S. military is so opposed to these kinds of interventions?
Tolga.
Tolga, thanks for it. Mr. Ambassador, a general question about the U.S. administration stance on Syria. Do you think that a kind of disengagement process has started in terms of the stance of the administration on Syria? Because we know that some different agencies were involved in this issue. CIA were possible with some weapon transfers to the region, for example, in the last years. It's not significant about the last years, the press report. But it seems that there is a discussion within the administration in terms of this disengagement level. And it seems that since the agreement, CWA agreement, it has been stopped. Could you define that process as a disengagement with the administration? And is there any discussion within the administration in terms of this new policy? Because some sources confirm that even some high-level CIA officials resigned at the end of September because of this shift. And also, I have another question for you, Mr. Cebeci. What will be the impact of this shift if there is what will be the impact of this shift to see this stance, to Turkey showing this stance to Syria? And do you think that Turkey also will be an exit of Syria?
Can you restate that
Very
question?
briefly, yes. He was saying CIA was supplying weapons at some point, and apparently the chemical weapons deal, after this deal, is kind of stalled, or it's being cancelled. So what would be the sort of impact evaluation? Has this stopped? That's the first question. And second question is if it has stopped, how would that impact Turkey's efforts to support the opposition, and does Turkey have an exit plan? So we'll start with Aram.
Well, on the first point about 30 years versus a decade, you were paying attention, and I think you know that I made it very clear this would take at least a decade.
Yeah.
And the words "at least" are not a reflection of my view that it's going to take a decade. We're talking about a number of unknowns. I do very much agree that we need to have at least some effort to put the reconstruction issue on the table. The problem with these dynamics, and you point this out well, economics and infrastructure and social reconstruction take a back seat because everyone's too busy trying to win. The countries that will try to put things like this on the forefront, ironically, will be the countries that either have the least amount of influence, namely countries like Jordan and Lebanon, or on the other hand, countries with the most, like the United States. The problem that Syria faces, and this is as much true in terms of what Mark described as the JCS filibuster, is that there are a lot of things that need to be done in Syria. There are a lot of things that countries want to do on moral grounds, let alone for strictly humanitarian reasons. And all of these, whether they're requirements or hopes or expectations, are coming at a time when you've had the worst set of resourcing pressures on the countries that actually can do something and that can support institutions. I'm not talking about countries that have resources but are focused on a specific set of really national outcomes, countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. These are not the countries that are going to usher in the new social contract in Syria, or that are going to drive some kind of political representation, or reforming the banking system, or integrating Syria into the world market. The problem is that countries that can do this, like the US, like France, and other key allies in the West, are dealing with the real effects of trying to do policy in a part of the world that is important, but that, to use the US example, is no more important than trying to get Detroit on its feet or addressing very real domestic political and economic grievances. Again, the reason I pointed out that the Marshall Plan, there won't be one in the short term or any analog, is that we're dealing with the Middle East at a time when the French don't have, neither do the British, frankly, real-world logistics and power projection, let alone the kinds of resources to do real-world reconstruction alone. It certainly all needs to be on the table, but the reason you have this pushback from the U.S. military as far back as 2011 ties into this idea that all of this is very big. You have so many competing local, regional, and international aspirations, so many differences about what victory should look like and for whom, all in a country that has been dealing with all of the worst kinds of ethnic and socioeconomic pressures, not just since the Assads came to power, but since the formation of the modern Syrian state. And from a U.S. military standpoint, I think they were the first to kind of sound the alarm on this one and say, we're happy to support an end state, we're happy to push this and to do whatever the president asks us to do. The question is, what exactly is the end state going to look like? As Fred points out, what exactly is the strategy? And how does this tie into a dispassionate, and again, it doesn't sound very humane, but rational set of assessments of what is the U.S. national interest?
Thank you.
I think if I counted correctly, I think there were three questions tossed my way. The first has to do with the likelihood or unlikelihood of Moscow and the regime staying on the same page at Geneva. The short answer is I don't know. The somewhat longer answer is there was an NGO here in town that a few weeks ago conducted a rather detailed simulation of a Geneva conference based on conditions that pretty much still prevail as of today. And what the simulation produced was a situation where Moscow and the regime, in a very disciplined and coordinated way, did indeed stay on the same page through Geneva, mainly because of the strategic stakes involved. The United States and the opposition did not perform in a parallel way. The opposition, unsurprisingly, had some issues with internal unity, and the American attitude was what I kind of describe as, this will age me a bit, I guess, the old Rodney King, why can't we all just get along and have a good dialogue here and be reasonable? That version of diplomacy does not work in situations like this. If we're not prepared to go to Geneva, and pardon my French, be sons of bitches about it, we shouldn't go. We just shouldn't go. On the DoD non-appetite for kinetic action in Syria, I think that's correct. I think General Dempsey and the others essentially saw Syria as a distraction. I have no doubt, as a former military officer, that they would have been prepared to execute something of considerable violence and effect had they been given the requisite directive by the President of the United States. At the end of the day, the only vote that counts here is that of the Commander-in-Chief. Does the United States have any other leverage here, given the fact, given what I believe to be the case, that the credible threat of military action has evaporated? Do we have any other significant leverage? I hate to be so 20th century about this, but I suspect not. I suspect without that credible threat, then the really key factor here is a regime that believes it is winning and therefore has no appetite to be transitioned and no objective reason to feel it ought to be transitioned. As a disengagement process started, and I think this was related to the question of lethal assistance, what I have to say here is kind of limited. I mean, like everybody else, I'm aware of press reporting that a certain part of the United States government has been involved, I take it, in some low-level arming and training activities, levels low enough, I suspect, not to make any significant difference on the ground. As a general rule, I don't see the United States disengaging from Syria. We will have no more luck disengaging from Syria than Harry Truman had disengaging from Korea in 1950 or 1951. There are things that happen in this world that limit the ability of even the President of the United States to do the stuff he really wants to do, whether it's the Affordable Health Care Act or the pivot to East Asia Pacific. Syria is an unfolding catastrophe that under current trends will continue to get worse. There is no way the United States disengages from this. It just can't happen. And for what it's worth, kind of pulling together this question and the question of leverage and all of that, what I've recommended is that the President seek and that Congress provide authorization for the U.S. Department of Defense to arm, equip, and train what is left of this middle-of-the-road Syrian nationalist armed opposition in the hope of enabling these folks to defend vulnerable populations and, yes, in essence, wage a two-front conflict, defending against the regime and also defending against Al-Qaeda and other jihadists. Is that a heavy lift? You bet. Is that operationally difficult? You can count on it. Would it have made a lot more sense to have done this a year and a half ago? Would it have been easier? You bet. Our option now is really to try to do something here, or just decide we're just going to be spectators, and we're going to watch our interests and those of our friends and allies in the region just go straight down the tubes.
If you look at the Syrian problem as just Syrian problem, a country's problem, then the conclusions that we would reach would be very much different from a situation where you look at the Syrian problem, a problem that affects an entire region. And this region is not a region that is easily ignored by the superpowers of the world. That is for the United States. Now, I have been asked this question earlier in several meetings. Can you please define the strategic interests of the United States in Syria? And you might not be able to come up with a logical answer for most of those hardcore analysts or experts in the area. But if you answer that question as a region and the effects and the instability it creates in the region, then you can convince easily anybody, not only the experts, but to even in a larger extent to general public. Now, in terms of the reconstruction efforts and what happens after conflict thing, at this point, the Syrian population, the group who opposes the regime, is asked whether to live with the like of Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra or the regime. And I've been reading reports that it will be their choice, this is one or the other. And if you left those people with those two choices, obviously it is their right to make the choice, but whichever choice that they make, they know that they will not be winning this thing. Now, as the Master Hoff is suggesting that fighting with both, and I hope and pray that they don't have to, will be very difficult and almost an impossible task. But this was not the choice 2 years, 2.5 years, 1.5 years, even 1 year ago. And if the international community does not come to, and when I say international community, I don't mean the 192 countries. Few of the regional countries and the US and the European powers come together and have a common understanding that this crisis, if it is not solved, its cost will increase, and this cannot be seen as a Syrian problem. Then 1 year, 6 months down the road, we will probably be talking something larger than this. Now, the appetite of the military, and this is very understandable from our perspective, but they didn't have to come to this point. The US could have shown political leadership in the earlier stages, and there is a military intervention, and there is degrees of this military intervention. A serious threat of using military, if it made the Assad regime to give up its chemical weapons, maybe that is this option, it is used earlier in the conflict, could have resulted in much different outcomes. And I don't think that the US military, maybe it is, let me put it this way, I don't want to believe that US military would go against any military action. It will be calculated and properly measured, all these things. But this is an option that the rulers of the countries, the presidents, elected leaders have this as a tool. So you cannot have a world operating properly if you take one of the most serious tools of policy, so to speak, out of table. So I am, at this point, it is not the best interest of the United States to take out a tool that we know really works on the Syrian regime out of the toolbox, and the disengagement and the Turkey's exit strategy. It is, if you ask me this question, has Turkey read the entire situation in Syria much worse than anybody else? My answer will be a flat no. That Turkey has read the situation equally worse
Equally bad.
as anybody else. But the thing is that having a 600-mile border and that proximity gives you disproportionate negative consequences of reading it equally worse. So with the same logic, probably I don't think that Turkey has cornered itself in a position. It is still, with all the domestic opposition, I think it still has a certain support within the domestic population. So I don't see the government politically in danger because of the Syrian policy. It has security threats, but I mean, Turkey has means to counter these both soft and hard security threats that will come up from Syria. And the conflict prolonging, but that is not the preferred option, obviously. But I think that the policymakers are flexible enough, and not necessarily maybe in Syrian policy, but in certain policies with Iraq and Iran, there are certain nuances, and you can see the indications of the change, and that will eventually probably will be helpful in Syria.
Okay, thank you. I'll give you a minute if you want to closing remarks, and then we'll finish.
I could close perhaps by just re-emphasizing something that's probably pretty obvious. That from the point of view of policymakers, this really is a problem from hell, and there are no easy options here. I think that President Obama's desire to hold this problem at arm's length to the maximum extent possible, to hope that it just somehow migrates from his inbox to somewhere else, to hope that the chemical weapons agreement can, in essence, check the box. I think this is all understandable. Okay? I think it's defensible. All right? I'm not going to sit here and accuse the President of the United States of stupidity or negligence. But I would just emphasize that when we think in Syria about unintended consequences, let's not just talk about the hypotheticals of firm action. Let's talk about what's staring us in the face, the unintended consequences of a policy that has basically lacked a clear articulation of U.S. national security objectives, and certainly lacked a clear strategy to bring about objectives.
Thank you.
All I can do is echo everything Fred said, just add one little point. Yes, a lot of this is like the 20th century. It does seem like there is less influence for the U.S. than is needed. But don't mistake a divisive interagency debate within the U.S. government, let alone a divisive debate within the policy community, for a real decline in U.S. influence over the longer term, in dealing not just with Syria, but the emerging threats in the region. Right now, One of the major challenges is that you've got too many local allies working at cross purposes. And ultimately, there will always be a need for a U.S. that is able to firmly say, as it has during the first Gulf War, as it has controversially before the lead-up invasion of Iraq, and other times throughout history, that this is vital to us and we can make it vital to you as well. And what do we mean by that? I mean a stable end state in Syria, marshalling the resources of countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf allies that otherwise might waste them on ideological efforts to shape an outcome that maybe even we don't want in terms of radicalization of the war within Islam. And ultimately, Russian allies that frankly can't carry this very far and are allies only in name and are going to try and compete with limited resources too. If we don't exert this level of influence, the main deciders of how far and how deep competition goes will be Iran and Saudi Arabia. And in the longer term, that's not the best outcome for either the US or Russia, let alone the Syrian people.
From the Syrian conflict, what we should conclude so far, what we have learned, whatever happens in the region, two things are there, and the future policy decisions, both in Syria and in other conflicts, has to take that into account. One is the sectarian warfare, and any problem can easily be turned into a sectarian struggle and warfare. And that is not good for the people, for the countries of the region, and for the US or Russia or any power in the world. I mean, it is something that might serve for the short term, will not be serving in the interests of the long term. The second thing is the kinds of Al-Qaeda and terrorist organizations. Now it is clear that they will look for any country that there is a vacuum that they think, and that they will go and try to be part of that. So these things actually were known by the learned people of advisors and the experts in all of the countries, but both of them were ignored in Syria. And the last sentence that I would like to make is that obviously I live in this country and I understand the sensitivities of the population and masses in terms of priorities of the US government. But you are either the US is either the leader of the world and has certain leverage and power and influence, or it is not. Once you create an expectation that you can do things, but it creates disappointments in the region for the countries, then the next time this will be worse. And it is every action that US is making on the basis of its domestic public opinion will have consequences for the perception of US power and the influence of US in the world. And this has to be known by everybody. Thank you.
Right, well, join me in thanking this panel.